The night of my birthday party should have been filled with laughter, love, and celebration. Instead, it became the night my own brother humiliated me in front of our entire family. He thought his cruel words would drive me away forever. But what he didn't realize was that he had just handed me the perfect reason and the perfect weapon to finally bring him down. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I still remember the way the words left his mouth, dripping with smug satisfaction, like he had been rehearsing them for weeks. The best gift would be you leaving forever. He said it in front of everyone, my parents, my cousins, my aunts and uncles. It was supposed to be my birthday celebration, a night about me, but in an instant, he had twisted the spotlight onto himself. The room froze. A few people gave nervous chuckles, the kind of awkward laughter that spills out when you don't know whether something is supposed to be funny or not. Others stared down at their drinks, pretending they hadn't heard what he'd just said. I just stood there, holding my plate, my smile frozen in place like a mask that was cracking at the edges. Inside, it felt as if a bucket of ice water had been poured over me. My face burned, but my hands were trembling cold. 100 different responses raced through my head, snapping back at him, walking out, demanding someone defend me, but nothing made it past my lips. All I managed was a tight swallow as I set my plate back down on the buffet table. I could feel the sting of tears gathering, but I blinked hard, refusing to let them fall. He wanted me to crumble, and I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I forced myself to breathe, long and steady, even as my stomach knotted so tightly I thought I might be sick. The thing about moments like that is they don't just hurt because of the words themselves. They hurt because of who said them. This wasn't some stranger at work, or a rude guest who barely knew me. This was my brother, my own blood. The person who had grown up beside me, shared Christmas mornings, fought over the TV remote, and whispered secrets in the dark when we were kids. And yet, there he was, standing in front of everyone, essentially announcing that my absence would be the greatest gift of all, but no one came to my defense. Not a word from my parents, who looked down at their plates like they hadn't heard him. Not a whisper from the relatives who had been all too happy to eat the cake I had bought, to drink the wine I had chosen. It was like I had been erased in that moment, as if his voice carried more truth than my existence ever had. I excused myself as casually as I could, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "I'll just step outside for some air." I smiled as I said it. Smiled so no one would see how much I wanted to run. Out on the patio, I let myself exhale, finally dropping the mask. The cool night air pressed against my flushed cheeks, grounding me. I gripped the railing and stared out into the darkness, replaying his words over and over until they felt carved into my skull. The best gift would be you leaving forever. That wasn't just a joke. It wasn't even just cruelty. It was a declaration. He wanted me gone. From the party, yes, but more than that, from the family itself. He wanted to erase me, to claim the role of favorite, of center, of heir, without me standing in his way. I should have been furious in that moment. I should have stormed back inside and told him off. But the truth is, I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was deeper than that. It was the slow, sinking weight of betrayal, a cold realization that the person I had once looked up to as a child had grown into a man who despised me enough to wish me out of his life completely. Standing out there, listening to the muffled laughter and clinking glasses through the patio doors. I made myself a quiet promise. I wouldn't let him erase me. He wanted me gone. But what he didn't realize was that I wasn't going anywhere. In fact, that night was the spark, the cruel, careless spark that lit the fire of my resolve. I wasn't just going to stay. I was going to make sure he would regret ever opening his mouth in the first place. And that vow, though silent in that moment, would carry me through everything that came after: the lies he spread, the games he played, and ultimately, the justice that was waiting for him at the end of it all. That night, my birthday was ruined. But the story that began there? That was just getting started. Asterisk when I look back. The truth is, my brother and I had always been very different people. We grew up in the same house, raised by the same parents, but we seemed to live on opposite ends of every spectrum. I was the quieter child, content with books, long walks, and listening more than speaking. I never craved the spotlight. What mattered most to me was harmony, making sure people around me felt comfortable, that conflicts were eased before they grew sharp edges. My brother, on the other hand, was born hungry for attention. Even as a child, he could command a room with his stories, half of which were exaggerated or outright fabricated. He loved being the loudest voice at the table, the one everyone turned to. At first, it was almost charming. He had a way of making people laugh. But the older we grew, the more his charm turned sour. What had once been a need for attention evolved into a need to belittle others, especially me, to keep himself in the center. He was my parents' firstborn, and whether they admitted it or not, he was their golden child. Not because he was particularly successful, though he did have a knack for talking himself into jobs or opportunities, but because he had a confidence that dazzled people on the surface. To them, his arrogance looked like ambition. To me, it looked like insecurity wrapped in bravado. I often wondered if that was why he resented me so deeply. Because while I wasn't loud, I worked hard, quietly, steadily, and over time. That work had begun to pay off. When I earned my promotion earlier that year, it wasn't because I'd charmed anyone. It was because I'd spent late nights poring over reports, going the extra mile, and proving myself through consistency. I could feel his jealousy even before he spoke it aloud. At first, it came as sly remarks. "Don't get too comfortable in that office. You know how quickly companies can change their mind." Or, "Guess it pays to be lucky sometimes." At family dinners, he would cut in when people asked me about my job. He'd roll his eyes, laugh, and say something like, "Careful. She might bore you to death with spreadsheets and meetings." I tried to brush it off, telling myself it wasn't worth fighting over. That's what I had always done. Ignored the jabs, smoothed over the tension, convinced myself he didn't mean it as harshly as it sounded. But somewhere deep down, I knew better. The warning signs had been there long before the night of my birthday party. They were in the way he'd interrupt me mid-sentence, the way he'd turn my small victories into punchlines, the way he seemed to take delight in watching me shrink back so he could shine brighter. And the saddest part, 4 years, I enabled it. I thought staying quiet was the noble choice, that I was keeping the peace. But the reality was that every time I swallowed my discomfort, I was handing him permission to keep going. Still, I clung to hope that maybe, just maybe, he would grow out of it. That one day he would look at me not as competition but simply as his sister. Someone who wanted nothing more than to share a family with him. But that hope shattered at the party. His cruel remark didn't just come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of digs and mockery. It was him finally saying out loud what his actions had been whispering for a long time. that he didn't see me as his equal, or even as someone who belonged. If you had asked anyone else at the party to describe him, they probably would have called him charming, confident, maybe even the life of the gathering. That was the mask he wore. But I knew the truth underneath. I knew the insecurity that drove him, the bitterness that curdled inside him whenever someone else got a sliver of attention he thought belonged to him. And I also knew myself. I wasn't a saint, and I wasn't spineless. I had simply chosen, time and again, to take the higher road, to avoid feeding into his games. But what he didn't realize was that the higher road has its limits, and once you push someone too far, that road stops being about peace. It becomes about justice. That night on the patio, the memory of all his little jabs and smirks came flooding back. The promotion he couldn't stand me earning. The way he twisted family dinners into stages where I was the punchline. The smirk when my parents looked away instead of defending me. The pattern was clear. He had been laying the groundwork for that cruel birthday remark for years. I had just been too patient, too hopeful, to admit it. But admitting it was the first step. And once I did, there was no going back. Asterisk. Asterisk if the little jabs and smirks were cracks in the foundation of our relationship. That night was the earthquake that split it wide open. It was supposed to be a celebration. My birthday, my milestone. A rare evening when my family gathered not for a holiday, but for me. I had bought the cake, arranged the catering, even helped my mother set up the house with decorations. It wasn't extravagant, but it was thoughtful. I had wanted it to be a night of warmth, and for the first hour, it almost was. I remember greeting relatives, hugging cousins I hadn't seen in months, listening to uncles tell the same jokes they always did. I remember thinking, just for a moment, that maybe this year would be different. Maybe, despite my brother's usual antics, he'd let me have this one night. Then came the toast. He tapped his glass with a fork, commanding the room's attention with the ease of someone who had always assumed. People wanted to hear him speak. I should have known right then that nothing good would follow. I think, he began, grinning wide, that the best gift for my name's birthday. He paused, letting the room quiet down, letting the anticipation build. His grin stretched, and then he said it. The best gift would be you leaving, forever. The words hung in the air like smoke. For a split second, there was silence. And then came the uneasy laughter, the sideways glances, the forced smiles. My parents looked down at their plates. A few people chuckled, not because it was funny, but because they didn't want to be the ones who didn't laugh. I stood there, frozen, my wine glass half raised, my smile still plastered on my face as if it had been painted there. My ears rang, and though the room was full of chatter and clinking cutlery, all I could hear was his voice echoing in my head. The humiliation was sharp, but what cut deeper was the betrayal. It wasn't just the words themselves, cruel as they were. It was the fact that not a single person came to my defense. My father didn't clear his throat in disapproval. My mother didn't scold him. No cousin spoke up. In that moment, it felt like everyone had silently agreed with him, that my absence would indeed be the greatest gift. I swallowed hard, forcing my breathing to stay steady. I told myself, don't give him what he wants. He wanted me to snap, to cry, to storm out and prove him right. Instead, I set my glass down, smoothed the hem of my dress, and smiled as calmly as I could. Excuse me, I said softly, my voice steady though my heart was pounding. I need some air. And with that, I walked outside, every step measured, my back straight, as if I hadn't just been gutted in front of my entire family. On the patio, The night air hit me like a shock. I gripped the railing, staring out into the garden lights, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. My mind raced with every memory of his smirks, his comments, his little cruelties over the years. It all funneled down into this one moment, this public declaration that he wanted me gone. I thought of the hours I'd spent helping my mother with the party, the cake I had chosen with care, the bottles of wine I'd splurged on, and I thought of how easily, with one sentence, he had stripped all of it away, turned my night into his stage, my humiliation into his punchline. That was the line. That was the moment when I realized that ignoring him, excusing him, brushing it off, it wasn't working anymore. His cruelty wasn't just a habit. It was escalating. He wasn't satisfied with mocking me in small ways anymore. He wanted me erased, pushed out, humiliated so thoroughly that even my own family would begin to see me as an outsider. And for the first time in my life, I let myself feel the full weight of that truth. I wasn't just hurt. I wasn't just embarrassed. I was done. Standing out there in the cold. I didn't have a plan yet. I didn't know how I would do it. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would no longer play the role he had written for me. I would not be his punchline, his shadow, his scapegoat. If he wanted me gone so badly, then he was going to find out what life without me really meant. And when that time came, he would regret ever wishing it. That night, under the soft hum of the patio lights, with laughter still drifting from inside, I drew a quiet line in the sand. And my brother, whether he knew it or not, had just crossed it. Asterisk I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that after the birthday incident, my brother would feel he had gotten his laugh and be satisfied. Maybe, I thought, he would let it go. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that people like him rarely stop once they know they can get away with cruelty. Instead, the taste of power only makes them hungry for more. The days after the party were quiet on the surface, but there was a shift. I could feel it in the silence of my phone, in the way certain relatives didn't respond to my messages like they used to. The ones who had laughed nervously at his joke now seemed to keep their distance from me. I wondered how many of them had replayed the moment in their heads and thought, well, maybe he has a point. And then the whispers began. A cousin reached out one afternoon, almost apologetic. I just wanted to let you know. Your brother's been saying some things. About you. About how you've been acting since your promotion. I felt my stomach drop. What kind of things? That you've changed. That you talk down to people now. That you're arrogant. The cousin trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Arrogant. It was almost laughable. If anything, I had bent over backwards to avoid flaunting my success. I had always downplayed my achievements, sometimes to a fault, just so people wouldn't think I was bragging. But hearing that word used against me, his word, it hit me like a slap. That was when I realized he wasn't satisfied with humiliating me once. He wanted to poison the well. He wanted to make sure that even when I wasn't in the room, people saw me through his lens. As someone undeserving, someone to be mocked, someone whose presence was a burden. It didn't stop there. At the next family dinner, which I almost didn't attend, he stood up with his wine glass raised high. A toast, he announced, grinning from ear to ear. Everyone quieted, expecting something light-hearted. To my sister, he began, with a mock solemnity. The hardest worker in the room. Just ask her, she'll tell you. Laughter rippled across the table. But it wasn't warm laughter. It was sharp, biting, at my expense. He smirked, taking a sip, clearly proud of himself. I sat frozen, my fork heavy in my hand. My heart thudded against my ribs, my face hot with shame. I wanted to disappear under the table, but I forced myself to breathe, to keep my face composed. I could feel my parents' discomfort, but again, they said nothing. Their silence hurt more than his words. That night, when I went home, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake replaying it all in my head. The whispers, the toast, the smirk on his face when he knew he had won the room, and a realization slowly sank in. This wasn't just sibling rivalry anymore. This wasn't teasing. This was a campaign. He was actively working to push me out of the family circle, to isolate me, to make me the villain in a story I hadn't even written. The escalation was deliberate. He had moved from private jabs to public humiliation, and now to character assassination. Each step was bolder, more calculated. He was testing how far he could go, how much he could get away with. And the worst part, the family was letting him. Their laughter, their silence, their refusal to call him out. It gave him permission. I felt cornered, trapped in a narrative he had created. Every time I tried to speak up, to assert myself, I risked proving him right in their eyes. If I defended myself too strongly, I would look defensive. If I stayed silent, I looked guilty. He had boxed me in with his lies. But what he didn't know was that cornered people don't always crumble. Sometimes, being pushed into a corner gives you the clearest view of your way out. That night, lying awake in the dark, I felt something shift inside me. I was tired of being the butt of his jokes, tired of carrying the weight of his jealousy, tired of shrinking so he could shine. He thought he was clever, spreading lies, but he didn't know that I had my own kind of cleverness. Quiet, steady, patient, and unlike him, I didn't waste it on cruelty. I didn't have a plan yet, but I could feel the beginnings of one forming. A whisper in the back of my mind reminding me that the truth has a way of surfacing, and that sometimes all it takes is one sharp push to bring a liar's whole facade crashing down. But before I could strike back, he wasn't finished. He had more humiliation in store. He wanted to push me until I broke. And in doing so, he pushed himself closer and closer to the edge of his own downfall. Asterisk. The last straw didn't come with fanfare or announcement. It came quietly, almost casually, but with a precision that made it unforgettable. It was a Sunday afternoon, a small family lunch at my parents' house. The sun streamed in through the windows, painting the dining room in warm light. And for a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, things would be calm. Perhaps he would behave, at least for a few hours. I should have known better. He was already there, lounging in the living room, a smug grin on his face as he recounted some story from work. I smiled politely, taking my seat, trying to appear normal. I had learned, over years of practice, that composure was my best defense. But that day, composure wouldn't save me. Halfway through the meal, he reached across the table under the guise of casual conversation, or so it seemed, and knocked over my glass of red wine. The liquid splashed across the table, dripped onto my hands, and landed with a wet splat on the pristine tablecloth. "Oh, clumsy you," he said, laughing lightly. "Always in the way, aren't you?" The room froze again. My parents exchanged awkward glances. Cousins and aunts murmured quietly, and I, for the first time in years, felt something inside me snap. This wasn't an accident. I knew it. He had been watching me, leaning just enough, angling the glass, smirking as the crimson spread across my hands. The insult wasn't in the spill. It was in the deliberate cruelty, the timing, the theatricality of it. I felt my stomach tighten into a cold, hard knot. My hands were shaking, but I forced them to remain still. I focused on keeping my breathing even, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. And in that moment, a clarity washed over me. The same clarity I had felt the night of my birthday party, but sharper, more determined. I had endured years of his manipulations, his petty humiliations, his subtle campaigns to turn our family against me. And now, he had pushed me too far. I decided then, right there, that I wouldn't let him continue. Not quietly, not politely, not ever again. But the decision wasn't just about standing up for myself. It was about justice. I wasn't going to retaliate with another insult or a petty joke. That would be satisfying for a moment, perhaps, but it wouldn't address the truth. The truth was that he had been hiding a darker side all along: arrogance, greed, and a complete lack of regard for anyone but himself. And if I wanted to truly reclaim my place, to restore balance, I would need to be smart. I would need leverage. That evening, after he left the room still chuckling over his practical joke, I sat quietly at the table with my parents. I said nothing about the incident, but I began thinking, analyzing, recalling every conversation, every boast, every careless remark he had ever made. I remembered the countless times he had spoken about the family business in passing, the sly comments about accounts, about how things were managed. I realized something significant. He had been sloppy. His ego had made him careless. He had left traces of his greed and manipulation, tiny breadcrumbs that someone paying attention could follow. For the first time in a long time, I felt empowered rather than trapped. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about creating a plan that would ensure he could never belittle me again. That night, I started going through old paperwork I had helped organize for my mother. Receipts, emails, statements. At first, it was just idle curiosity, revisiting the past. But soon, patterns emerged. Numbers that didn't add up, withdrawals that didn't make sense, mentions of purchases I hadn't seen him make openly. And then it clicked. The unique weapon was there, hidden in plain sight. Evidence of his misdeeds that no one had noticed because they trusted him blindly. Because he had cultivated an image so polished and confident that no one doubted him. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the documents spread before me. I didn't feel anger anymore. Not exactly. I felt a quiet, resolute satisfaction. I had found my leverage. I had found the truth he had tried so hard to hide, and now, with that clarity, I knew exactly what I had to do. This was no longer just about surviving his cruelty. This was about turning the tables in a way that was intelligent, calculated, and utterly satisfying. He had thought he was untouchable, that his arrogance and deceit would go unnoticed. But he had underestimated me, my patience, my attention to detail, my resolve. He had crossed the line, and for the first time, I was ready to show him just how far the consequences could reach. That night, after the wine spill incident, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, replaying every insult, every smirk, every quiet comment my brother had made over the years. But amid the turmoil, one thought kept returning. He's careless. He always has been. I remembered a conversation from months ago when he had boasted, almost arrogantly, about handling the accounts for our parents' small family business. He spoke as though it was a game, a clever way to line his pockets without anyone noticing. At the time, I had brushed it off, thinking my parents were aware and in control. I had no reason to dig deeper back then. But now, in the quiet of my living room, that boast felt like a key turning in a lock. I retrieved the files I had kept from helping my mother with taxes and business records, receipts, invoices, emails. The documents were boring on the surface, pages of numbers and mundane notes. But as I scanned them carefully, my heart began to race. Patterns emerged. Withdrawals that didn't match the purchases. Transfers that seemed innocent but were anything but. And small notations, reimbursement for personal use, that were never authorized. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. My brother had left a trail, a breadcrumb path that, if followed, would reveal every act of greed and deception he had committed. I leaned back, letting the realization sink in. This wasn't about anger. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment retaliation. This was about leverage. Undeniable, irrefutable, and satisfying. I had the proof he didn't think anyone would find. For hours, I carefully cataloged everything. Emails that mentioned expenses he had charged to the family accounts. Receipts for luxury items that had no business being there. Notes from meetings he had supposedly attended on behalf of the business. That suggested entirely different expenditures. I double-checked each one, knowing that any mistake could weaken my position. And then it hit me. This wasn't just evidence. This was a weapon, a way to level the playing field, to shift the power that had been his for so long. I allowed myself a quiet, small smile. Finally, the pieces were falling into place. The plan wasn't about revenge in the emotional sense. It was about justice. My brother had spent years manipulating, belittling, and attempting to isolate me. Now, the scales could be balanced, and not just balanced, tilted in a way that was perfectly deserved. The next step was clear. I had to be strategic. I couldn't confront him impulsively. I couldn't let emotion dictate the timing or execution. Instead, I needed a setting where the truth would land with impact, where the family could see the reality of his actions for themselves. It had to be public, undeniable, and dramatic enough to counter years of his manipulations. I imagined the upcoming family gathering, one of our larger events, where everyone would be present. It was perfect. I would present the evidence carefully, calmly, step by step. I would let the facts speak for themselves. And when he realized the trap I had quietly built, there would be no escape. No laughter, no excuses, no denial strong enough to save him. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. I wasn't acting out of spite. I was acting out of clarity. My brother had crossed a line, and now the scales of justice were in my hands. I spent the following days refining my approach. I organized the documents chronologically, highlighted key transactions, and prepared to speak clearly and calmly when the time came. Every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence had to be airtight. I imagined his smirk fading as each fact landed, imagining the room turning. Finally seeing him as he truly was. Not the charming, confident figure he projected, but the greedy, manipulative, petty man who had spent years undermining me. By the end of the week, the plan was fully formed. I had the weapon. I had the strategy. And most importantly, I had the resolve. He had underestimated me, as he always did. He had assumed that his charm and arrogance would protect him. But the truth doesn't need charm. It doesn't need theatrics. The truth, once revealed, has a weight all its own. And when the time came, that weight would fall squarely on his shoulders. ***. The day of the next big family gathering arrived, and with it, a strange mixture of nerves and quiet anticipation. I had spent weeks preparing, organizing the evidence, reviewing every email, every receipt, every document that would prove the truth about my brother's actions. I wasn't just armed with facts. I was armed with patience, with strategy, and with the certainty that the truth, finally revealed, would speak louder than any insult he had ever hurled at me. The house buzzed with the usual chatter, laughter, and clinking of glasses. Cousins caught up with each other, aunts fussed over platters of food, and my parents floated through the room greeting everyone. My brother, predictably, was at the center of attention, regaling everyone with stories that painted him as the clever, charismatic figure they all seemed to admire. I approached quietly, holding a folder of documents in my hands. I didn't announce myself. I didn't need to. The moment I began speaking, the room would quiet itself. And when I did speak, it was in my own calm, measured tone, the tone I had practiced in front of the mirror countless times. "I'd like to take a moment to speak," I began. My voice carried naturally, steady, and clear. Conversations hushed, eyes turned toward me, and even my brother's smirk faltered slightly. He probably thought I was making a small announcement about the gathering or thanking someone. Instead, I laid the foundation carefully. I reminded everyone of the family business, of how we all contributed, how my brother had been entrusted with responsibilities that affected more than just himself. I spoke slowly, deliberately, giving them time to follow along, to understand the significance of what I was about to reveal. Then I opened the folder. I presented the documents methodically, emails with his signature authorizing transfers, receipts for personal expenses drawn from family funds, notations that had been disguised as legitimate business spending. I explained each one clearly, without embellishment, without anger. I let the facts speak for themselves. "Here," I said, pointing to a particularly incriminating email. "You can see that he approved a transfer from our business account to his personal credit card for a luxury vacation." I let the words sink in. The room grew still. Even my brother's closest allies, who had laughed at me weeks ago, were now frowning, shifting uncomfortably. I continued, walking them through the pattern of mismanagement, showing how small deceptions had accumulated into something undeniable. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The clarity of the evidence, combined with my calm delivery, made it impossible for anyone to dismiss. As I spoke, I noticed the change in the room. Cousins exchanged glances, murmuring quietly. Aunts whispered to each other. My parents' faces tightened, shock and disappointment etching lines across their features. And my brother? He started to pale. His hands fidgeted with his glass. His confident, smug demeanor was cracking. I laid out the final piece of evidence slowly, deliberately, saving the most damning detail for last. "And here," I said, "you can see the repeated withdrawals and personal expenses he disguised as business spending over the past year. These are not minor errors or mistakes. They are intentional acts, and they affect the entire family." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. My brother opened his mouth, probably to deny or deflect, but no words came out. He realized immediately that this wasn't a conversation he could charm his way through. This wasn't a joke. The trap had been set carefully, methodically, and the evidence was irrefutable. For a long moment, I let the room absorb what I had revealed. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had a weight that no smirk, no charm, no laughter could counter. And as I looked around, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not just for myself, but for the justice of the moment. That's when I realized it. This was the turning point, the moment where everything shifted, where my brother's power evaporated, and the balance, long disrupted by his arrogance, was finally restored. I could see it the moment he understood. That confident smirk, the one he wore like armor, the one that had intimidated and belittled me for years, faltered. His face went pale, almost as if the blood had drained in shock. His hands, which had been casually gripping his wine glass, trembled slightly. "Wait," he stammered, his voice sharp but unconvincing. This isn't." The room was already silent. Eyes that had once followed his every move now focused on him with disbelief, disappointment, and a dawning sense of betrayal. Cousins who had laughed at my jokes in the past were now whispering to each other, nodding as they followed the trail of undeniable evidence I had laid before them. He tried to speak again, this time louder, more forceful. "I can explain. You don't understand the context." But no one was listening. He realized quickly that charm and excuses had no power here. The proof was meticulous, chronological, and undeniable. Every receipt, every email, every note was there, a meticulous record of his greed and manipulation. He had built a house of lies, and I had just pulled the foundation out from under him. His face twisted in frustration and denial, a mixture of rage and disbelief. The smirk that had once been so carefully cultivated was gone, replaced by panic. He glanced around the room, perhaps hoping for an ally, someone to validate him, but found only disappointed faces. My parents' eyes were hard now, their pride in him replaced by hurt and incredulity. "You," he spat, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "You set me up. This is a trap." I stayed calm, letting him unravel. Calmness, I had learned, was far more devastating than anger. "No," I said softly, deliberately. "This isn't a trap. This is the truth. And it's been here all along, hidden. Yes, but undeniable." The room seemed to shrink round him. Every whispered conversation, every sit-along glance, every awkward shuffle emphasized his isolation. The power he had wielded so effortlessly for years had evaporated in minutes. He realized he was no longer in control, and that realization struck harder than any accusation could have. He tried one last desperate tactic: charm. "Everyone, listen, she's exaggerating." But the room had changed. The family that had once laughed at me, the family that had tolerated his manipulations, now saw him clearly. Eyes narrowed, mouths set in disapproval. They were no longer fooled by his charm, no longer willing to accept his lies. His power, built on arrogance and deceit, crumbled beneath the weight of truth. As he faltered, the immediate consequences became clear. My parents, previously hesitant, exchanged a glance and made a silent, firm decision. The business he had been secretly exploiting, the privileges he had taken for granted, were no longer his to control. For the first time, he realized that the carefully cultivated life of entitlement he had built was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I watched him, feeling a quiet sense of vindication, not triumph born of malice, but the deep satisfaction of justice served. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, and now, at long last, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. The room remained tense, the silence heavy, as my brother finally sank back into his chair, defeated. No words, no excuses, no smirk remained. The arrogance that had fueled him for years, was gone. In its place, shock, rage, and the bitter taste of impotence. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Justice isn't always loud, isn't always vengeful. Sometimes, it's the quiet, unshakable truth, presented calmly, measuredly, with patience and precision. And when the scales tip, when the truth lands, it carries its own weight, heavier than any insult, sharper than any punch. And my brother had underestimated me, as he always did. But now, standing amidst the silence. It was clear that the tables had turned, irreversibly and completely. ***. The room was still tense, the air thick with a mix of disbelief and incredulity. When I delivered the final piece of evidence, the detail that would seal my brother's downfall, it was small, almost innocuous to the untrained eye, but to anyone paying attention, it was undeniable proof of his repeated manipulation and greed. A single mismanaged account that revealed the depth of his carelessness, highlighted by his own handwriting and authorization. I held it up gently, letting everyone see it. "This," I said, "is the last piece of the puzzle. Every single transaction, every excuse, every attempt to manipulate the family finances leads right here. And the person responsible has been sitting among us, smiling, laughing, pretending all was well." The room fell silent. Even the murmurings of disbelief stopped. Everyone could see it clearly now. There was no room for misinterpretation, no chance to spin the story. My brother's eyes widened as he realized the finality of what had been revealed. He stumbled over his words. But I held up a hand to pause him, speaking calmly, without a trace of triumph. "No explanations will change the truth. It's all here, and everyone can see it." His face twisted from shock to panic. For years, he had relied on charm, on theatrics, on the assumption that no one would question him. But in that room, under the calm weight of evidence and the attentive gaze of our family, all his defenses crumbled. The power he had wielded so confidently for so long was gone. I watched as the consequences became tangible. My parents, previously hesitant to intervene, now acted decisively. The control he had maintained over aspects of the family business was rescinded immediately. He could no longer manipulate accounts, dictate decisions, or present himself as the family's golden child in matters of finance or trust. The privileges he had long assumed were his by default were withdrawn, permanently, and the look on his face was priceless. Not just frustration, but the deep, unmistakable sting of realization. He had believed he was untouchable. He had believed that arrogance and charm could shield him from scrutiny. But that shield had shattered, leaving him exposed, powerless, and undeniably defeated. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. This wasn't vengeance for the sake of anger. It was justice. The humiliation he had aimed at me, the petty cruelties he had wielded as weapons, had been turned back on him through patience, intelligence, and careful strategy. He had played his hand, underestimated me, and now the consequences were clear. As he sat there, the room absorbing the full impact of his downfall, I realized that this moment was more than just victory. It was liberation, for me, for the family, and for the truth itself. The scales had finally balanced. The finality was almost surreal. He no longer held sway over the room, over the family, or over the narrative he had so long controlled. For the first time, he was just another person in the room, accountable for his actions, stripped of the illusions he had cultivated for so long. I took a deep breath, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction settle through me. The journey had been long, frustrating, and emotionally exhausting, but it had led to this, a moment of undeniable justice, a payoff that was not only satisfying but necessary. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, the tension giving way to whispered conversations and relieved glances, I knew that everything had changed. The balance of power, the respect, and the perception of truth had shifted irrevocably, and my brother would carry the memory of this moment for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder that arrogance and cruelty can never truly triumph over patience, intelligence, and justice. The days and weeks after the revelation felt almost surreal. The family, once quietly divided by my brother's manipulations, began to recalibrate. Conversations shifted, dynamics changed, and slowly a sense of balance returned to our gatherings. The tension that had always hovered like a shadow over family events dissipated, replaced by a newfound clarity. My brother, of course, did not take the fallout lightly. His pride had been wounded deeply, and for a while, he retreated into sulky silence. He avoided eye contact at gatherings, no longer the center of attention he had once demanded. The once confident, smirking figure was now quieter, hesitant, and cautious. The irony was delicious. The very arrogance that had once elevated him to the role of golden child had now become the reason for his downfall. My parents, initially shocked and perhaps embarrassed by the revelations, slowly began to rebuild trust, not in my brother, but in fairness and accountability. They implemented checks and balances in the family business, ensuring that no one person could have unchecked control again. And while my brother remained part of the family, his authority was permanently curtailed. As for me, the relief was profound. The heavy weight I had carried for years, the frustration, the humiliation, the subtle but constant undermining, lifted almost immediately after the confrontation. I no longer had to second-guess his comments, tiptoe around his whims, or silently endure his cruelty. I could finally speak freely, participate fully in family matters, and be seen for who I was, not as a target of jealousy or a victim of his arrogance. The shift wasn't just external, it was internal as well. I had proven to myself that patience, intelligence, and careful planning could triumph over cruelty and manipulation. I had not only defended myself but had done so in a way that was measured, fair, and satisfying. The justice I had sought wasn't impulsive or petty. It was precise, undeniable, and lasting. Family gatherings became, over time, warmer. People laughed without the edge of unease. Conversations flowed more naturally, and the subtle tension that had once clung to the edges of every event disappeared. My brother, no longer the manipulative center of attention, faded into the background, not as a villain, but as a reminder that actions have consequences. And as for the moral of the story, it became clear to everyone, including him, cruelty and arrogance may provide temporary power, but they are ultimately self-destructive. The smallest acts of patience, clarity, and intelligence can unravel even the most confident facade. In the quiet moments, I would sometimes reflect on that pivotal night of the birthday party, the spilled wine, and the long months of planning that followed. What had seemed like a personal humiliation at the time had become a turning point, a catalyst for justice, for empowerment, and for change. Life moved forward. My brother remained part of the family, but his behavior was tempered by experience and accountability. I found peace, a restored sense of self-worth, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served not through chaos, but through careful, deliberate action. The balance had returned, and this time, it was unshakable. ****